A new Gallup poll shows that support for stricter gun laws in the U.S. has dropped to an all-time low. Gallup has just released the results of its annual crime poll, and it shows that only 44% of Americans say that laws covering firearm sales should be made more strict. That is down 5 points in the last year and 34 points from the high of 78% back in 1990, the first time that question was asked. The poll also shows only 28% of Americans favor a ban on handguns. That's also a new low. And the Gallup poll follows right behind a survey done by Rasmussen reports that also shows that 50% of Americans are opposed to stricter gun control laws. Numbers which Scott Rasmussen told me clearly indicate more Americans now support our firearm freedoms and are realizing gun bans simply don't work. You got a new survey shows some pretty significant numbers. 50% of the people you polled are opposed to stricter gun control laws.
That's right. Only 39% think that we need stricter laws, and that's quite a shift from earlier in the year when people were evenly divided on the topic.
Mm-hmm. But do you see the trend has been moving this way?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And you know, this is something that has shifted in the last several months. Also, we've seen strong support for the notion that people do have the right to own a gun. 7 out of 10 Americans believe that is a constitutionally guaranteed right for an individual. And we also see resistance to some ideas. For example, the notion that the city would have the right to ban gun ownership, handgun ownership in the city. 69% say no, that is not allowed under the Constitution.
I was looking at that too. Very significant in itself, because with the U.S. Supreme Court taking up the whole issue of incorporation and the Chicago gun ban and whether it's unconstitutional, a lot of people, as your survey showed, they've been watching this, and most people in years past, the Supreme Court and what goes on, not always, top in their minds.
Well, that's true, but was last year, the year before, when the Washington D.C. case was resolved, and it was in favor of the Second Amendment. There was actually a spike in the approval for the Supreme Court itself. It was one of the rulings that really caught people's attention and generated a positive response for the court. So I think that was an early indication of the numbers we're seeing today.
But when you look at 69% of the public does not think that local governments have the right to enforce gun regulations and gun bans, that's a pretty significant number.
That's right. Now, the other part of the data does show that 46% of Americans, just under half, say it's too easy to get a gun in America. 33% say it's about right, and 13% say it's too hard. On that score, women and men have different views. So women overwhelmingly are saying it's too easy. Men are split between saying it's too easy and it's about right. So there is a sense that it is an individual right. There is a sense that cities don't have the right to ban handguns, but there is some level of concern about the ease with which people can buy guns.
And that is interesting, too, because you've seen, a big increase in firearm sales ever since President Obama moved into the White House.
And a majority of Americans believe that the reason that spike has occurred is because they fear stricter gun control laws are coming.
Yeah. When you break it down along party lines, Republicans still, 87% out there, but 52% of the Democrats say cities don't have the right to ban handgun ownership.
That's right. 52% of Democrats disagree with that. 72% of independents or unaffiliated voters. Where we continue to see a huge gap, though, is on the question of whether stricter laws are needed. 65% of Democrats say yes, they are. 69% of Republicans say no, they're not. And among those unaffiliated voters, 62% say we don't need stricter gun control laws. And I should point out, and we've talked about this before, when we start talking about gun control and this issue on a national basis, we miss a lot of the local and regional flavor. This issue is perceived much differently if you are living in a heavily congested inner city area than if you are living in a more rural part of the nation.
Yeah, and that's interesting you bring that up, because the attorneys from Chicago in this whole case that the court's going to take up, are talking about, hey, when you leave in an urban area, it is important for local governments to be able to enforce laws. But at the same time, when you look at the fact that their gun ban has done nothing and what they're dealing with gang violence, you gotta really wonder.
Yeah, and again, there is, the American people, this is something that is deeply ingrained in us. People believe that they have the right to govern themselves. They believe that government should be restricted. So, that's a natural tendency to support the Second Amendment, and, by the way, all of our other guarantees in the Bill of Rights. But that doesn't mean that people are simply willing to say that, everything's great as long as we play by those rules. They want to make sure that there are other facts in society that are working to build a better society, and they're saying gun control is not seen as a cure-all in any way, shape, or form for inner-city violence.
Mm-hmm. You also talked about and asked about Sonia Sotomayor.
Well, Justice Sotomayor, we've been asking about an awful lot, and it's going to be interesting to see what her numbers look like in a few months.
Yeah.
Because, truthfully, she had a massive introduction, but almost all the numbers from the start reflected how people felt about the man who nominated her, President Obama. And there is a perception that she is to the left of the political spectrum. There is a perception that the Supreme Court itself leans a little bit too far to the left. But I would caution that any numbers on a new justice are really just formed based on, at this point, President Obama.
But as you said, all eyes watch her because of the cases she's going to be soon handling, and one of them is the Chicago case. That's going to be very, very... But it was interesting because 31% of the voters see the current Supreme Court as too liberal.
Right.
Yeah.
And, that's been interesting to watch in the last few years. If we went back 20 years, there was an overwhelming belief the court was too liberal. The number began to shift towards a more centrist view, especially, when Justice Alito and Justice Roberts were added to the court. But now, more recently, we've seen the numbers begin to move back in the other direction, with the plurality saying the court being too liberal.
Yeah. It's going to be real interesting, as you said. But when you look at these numbers, and I know you probably didn't specifically, but do you see when you see this shift that you're talking about, do you see the president himself losing his base when it comes to Democrats and on this issue as well as other issues, really?
Certainly not on this issue. The president remains extraordinarily popular among Democrats. And it's been fascinating over the course of this year. Economics are still the number one issue that people are responding to, and Democrats have not lost faith in the president in that. Almost from the beginning, actually, since February, when the stimulus package was put into play, Republicans have been strongly opposed. But in the last few months, those unaffiliated voters have been drifting away from the president. And it's not truly over an issue like gun control at this point in time. It is about the economy. It's about the proposed health care plan. And there's something else that is driving all of these numbers and moving even beyond the president, and that is sort of a bipartisan sense that nobody in Washington is listening. As we have polled, we find that Americans were overwhelmingly opposed to the bailout program that began under the Bush administration. They were overwhelmingly opposed to the federal takeover of General Motors and Chrysler. Most did not like the Cash for Clunkers program. The people that got the money for it liked it, but most of the rest did not. And yet, despite all of the public opposition on these and other areas, the plans were passed anyhow. And so there is a great sense of frustration out there throughout the country that there is a bipartisan desire to ignore what the people are saying.
And that's why it's going to be so interesting to watch what happens in November.
It sure is. Well, I live in New Jersey. We've got the most exciting governor's race going in the nation right now. There's another governor's race in Virginia that's looking a little safer for the Republican Party. But those results will be watched very closely. And then the next big indicator will be election 2010. If you look out to a lot of those races for 2010 right now, the political environment for Democrats is absolutely horrible. But I keep cautioning Republicans who want to be excited about that there are two things they've got to remember. Number one, the election is still 14 months away, and in politics, that's an eternity. And number two, the Democrats have one thing going for them in this cycle that they did not have going for them back in 1994, and that's that in 1994, nobody could remember when the Republicans ran Congress. Right now, a lot of people remember, and a lot of people don't have pleasant memories of the Republicans in control, And so that will dampen their enthusiasm a little bit, no matter how depressed they are with the Democrats.
Hey, but when you look at your poll and you look at the numbers from Gallup showing, again, pretty much what you guys are showing, no doubt the gun issue going to be an important issue in these races.
Sure, as gun issue is always very important. We know it's played a role in the Virginia governor's race this year, and it is something that that is at this point in time, the resistance to new gun controls is growing.